Most fears are simply expansions on the fear of the unknown. Things that are unknown are risky. They can end up bad, and in ways that we never could have anticipated or planned for. They can end up good, but in a way that we're equally not ready to take advantage of, leading to a future full of regret. But fundamentally, something unknown is terrifying because there's nothing that you can do to prepare for it. Preparation will often result in getting in your own head and making the situation worse as you traumatize yourself all over again while thinking about it. Over the Garden Wall is a scary series in this more traditional definition. It does not rely on jump scares or gross outs. It doesn't seek to make the audience immediately discomforted. The horror comes from the moments after you watch the show, where the themes and plot devices are able to sit with you during a moment of calm, and that dread is able to seep in. Nothing is more terrifying than what you can come up with in your imagination, and a good storyteller will take full advantage of this. The story begins as early as 2004, when Patrick Mahale first envisioned the idea, which would be developed for a time before being pitched to Cartoon Network in 2006. They had hoped that this pitch could be developed into a feature-length movie, but this proved difficult to do. In spite of that, Mahale's talent was recognized, and he was brought on board to work on other projects, where his unique style would touch other shows, including The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack and Adventure Time. It wasn't until 2013 where the pilot, Tome of the Unknown, would be revealed, immediately garnering critical acclaim and getting approval for a miniseries that would become known as Over the Garden Wall. The show borrows heavily from animations from the early years of American cinema, combining them with mid-19th century folklore and operatic elements that can trace their roots as far back as Don Quixote, Dante's Inferno, or the Canterbury Tales, including the Gothic artwork that was inspired by those writings. By combining these elements with a contemporary but not too contemporary setting, it's able to invoke a sense of nostalgia for a time that the intended audience never could have lived through. It's the feeling of a time period that you never lived through, that the show's staff never lived through, and yet we still feel the ramifications of such cultural output today. This video is split up into individual episode retrospectives, which themselves are divided into sections where I first recap the episode, then explain some of the techniques used, then review the episode before finishing with a wrap-up where I include anything I couldn't find another place for. Over the Garden Wall occasionally deals with heavy themes and dark imagery, but it was nonetheless a cartoon targeted for children, so these themes are never presented in such a way as to potentially disturb viewers to an excessive extent, and I don't intend for this video to be any different. So without any further introduction, we'll start the story where it begins. Tome of the Unknown. The story begins following Wirt and Greg, two brothers seeking out the titular Tome of the Unknown by walking through the woods alongside a bluebird named Beatrice and a frog whose name changes every time he's referred to. Wirt is tired of walking, and Greg suggests that they find a goose to ride, though before Wirt can question where they'll find one, Greg runs off and is heard screaming. The source of his screams turns out to be excitement, as he's found a car made of vegetables. This car turns out to be owned by one John Crops, who offers to let them keep it if they can drive him into the city so he can meet a woman. But they're assaulted by crows on the way, crashing into a scarecrow, and leaving Wirt to fix the vehicle while Greg and John go into the city. There, John goes up on stage to play his guitar and impresses a cabbage woman. But the celebrations are short-lived as a murder of crows and other various farm pests assaults the veggie people, as the scarecrow they crashed into fell down when Wirt dislodged the car from it. As they're trying to flee the mob, Greg runs off again, screaming once more, loud enough to scare off the birds. This time the source of his screaming was excitement over finding a goose, which the group then rides off into the sunset, leaving John Crops and his new gal to settle back in the countryside. The Tome of the Unknown in this episode serves as a deleted plot device for the show properly. It's just an object that the duo is searching for to give some reason for why they're in the woods in the first place. And while the idea of a book containing all the information that has ever been forgotten can drive some speculation as to what it was that the boys forgot, the fact that it was dropped and replaced with the idea of leaving the woods gives this sort of speculation less credence. The rest of the episode still serves as a prototype of sorts for the series. The characterization is all there, though they lack some of the character that would define them later on. Wirt is much more amicable to Greg and his shenanigans, with the two coming across as much closer here than in the earlier episodes of the show. But what is still solidly intact is the show's tone. John Crops sings Shine On Harvest Moon, a popular song from the early 20th century, as well as Can't You See I'm Lonely, an original composed in a similar vein. These serve the role not only of being establishing character moments for John and his short development, but also grounding the setting in a specific era, giving the audience an idea as to what period is meant to be evoked. And these contrast the language used by Wirt and Greg, whose affectations are much more modern. It's subtle and doesn't get built upon or paid off until the series proper, but this sort of concept of being lost in time plays a greater role and is still kept in mind as early as the pilot. Tome of the Unknown works as a standalone tale, with a beginning, middle, but no end. The boys and Beatrice simply wandering into the fog to continue their journey. And although it seems as though they're in a better position, they never really got any closer to the tome, simply wandering aimlessly, but faster. It sets a somewhat pessimistic view on whether the destination is even achievable, and for the narration to imply that the story ends without much of an overarching conclusion implies this is not a story about destinations, but the journey to get there. The Old Grist Mill. Wirt and Greg are discussing names for the frog when Wirt realizes that the two are lost. He hears a chopping noise coming from the distance and tries to flee from it, but Greg runs towards the source of the noise and finds the woodsman chopping away a dark tree. The woodsman takes them into his home and lights them a fire, warning them that the beast lurks in the woods and promises to offer help if they let him finish his business first. Wirt plans on running away, but changes his mind when he starts to believe that the man may actually be trustworthy. But when Greg loses the frog and goes searching for it by backtracking along a candy trail he's left, he's chased by a large wolf with glowing eyes. The wolf breaks into the house and tries to attack the boys, who flee to the roof where they learn that the monster is after Greg's candy. So he throws them off the roof and the wolf chases it, getting crushed by the mill itself, which is destroyed in the scuffle. They're satisfied about having taken on the beast, until the woodsman returns from his business of extracting oil from the edelwood trees that was interrupted by their fight. He tells them that the wolf was not the beast, and that it's still out there, telling them to head north after admonishing Wirt for blaming the whole incident on his younger brother. The most striking part of this episode visually is the use of lighting to establish tone that it's setting out to achieve. At first, the boys are shrouded in darkness, the lack of vision adding to the sense of dread as they panic on what to do. But upon finding the woodsman, there is more light added to the frame, mostly coming from his lantern, which serves as a source of relief from the oppressing obstruction of the night. They start to acclimate to the new light as they're by the safety of the fire, but the next light source they see comes from the bright glowing eyes of the wolf that chases after them. These eyes stand out horrifyingly as they glow in the frame but do not cast shadows on the surrounding area the way that the lantern did. It sets up light as a force that is not exclusively a refuge. Some light is dangerous and some darkness can be trustworthy. And this reframing of the use of light comes into play later as the lantern is given new context. The characters themselves also have their establishing moment. Greg rarely shows fear in situations, even trying to compliment the wolf's eyes when he first lunges for the boy. His optimistic attitude is what prevents his sense of fear. He's not afraid of the woodsman and is more trusting of him from the outset. Meanwhile, Wirt was afraid of the woodsman before even seeing the guy, wanting to flee from the noises he made and being convinced otherwise by his brother's rash action. The woodsman too is established as an intimidating presence, but a knowledgeable one as well. It makes the woods seem like a hard place to thrive in, that takes a hard type of person to flourish. But he still has a soft spot when two children come to his door, foreshadowing later characterization. What this lesson also teaches is not to come to quick judgment. Wirt fears the woodsman even after he takes him into his home, only coming around to the guy by the time they're about to leave. He assumes that the wolf is the beast of which they were warned, but it was just a dog choking on a black turtle. And his suggestion to Greg to leave a trail to avoid getting lost is what led the danger to them in the first place, something Wirt tries to shift responsibility for until he's admonished by the woodsman. Hard times at the Huskin. After walking north all night, the boys come across a sign for Pottsfield. Wirt wants to go straight there, but Greg gets distracted by the noise of Beatrice, a bluebird who is caught in a thorn bush. She offers a favor in exchange for being freed and tries to take the boys to Adelaide of the pasture. But Wirt ignores her to go to Pottsfield, where the trio discover that the town is seemingly empty. It turns out they're all at a festival, peeling vegetables, wearing pumpkin costumes, and dancing around a maypole. They offer to let him stay, but Wirt only wants to leave, prompting anger from the town's elder, Enoch. He sentences them to a few hours of manual labor, culminating in them digging 2 great holes that they find skeletons inside of. Wirt, spurred on by Beatrice, is terrified that they've dug their own graves, but when a skeleton crawls out of the ground and dons a pumpkin costume, he realizes that the townsfolk were simply skeletons dressed as vegetables. Now free to go, Enoch expresses some displeasure that they still intend to leave, though he mentions that they'll join Pottsfield soon enough as they head deeper into the woods. Pottsfield is a portmanteau of Potter's Field, a name given to a gravesite for the unknown who couldn't afford a headstone to signify their location. The agricultural society the skeletons formed, coupled with the traditions they kept and included the boys in, backs this theory up, that the group, the townsfolk, were deceased from the beginning. When they express shock that the boys would want to leave, it could be because they're going against the natural order of life then death. Comments that they're far too early to show up reinforce this, as well as Enoch's last line that they'll join them soon enough. Once more, Wirt jumps to multiple conclusions about the nature of the town they come across. At first he believes that any sign of civilization must be positive. He wanders the streets hoping for aid. But the longer he spends inside of the town, the less trustful he grows. This is for the most part the effect of Beatrice's pessimistic attitude. She wants them to move on as quickly as possible, even trying to rope Greg into abandoning his brother to visit Adelaide instead. It's only when Wirt's perception of Pottsfield is at its lowest that the truth comes out. They're a town of skeletons simply celebrating a weird tradition, and they were never in any real danger. And despite the ominous tone surrounding the hints that Pottsfield is a place for the dead, it's not treated like some horrifying inevitability, but rather another part of any journey. The episode bookends with a shot of a leaf fluttering in the wind before coming to a stop as it gets caught on a fence. One could look too far into this and assume that the leaf is a metaphor for the brothers, simply blowing from place to place with an inevitable destination and no real direction on how or when to get there. This is the type of analysis that would typically be dismissed as reading too far into any other series, but Over the Garden Wall puts so much care into each shot and scene construction that it warrants this exact type of overthinking, much to the benefit of its rewatchability. Schooltown Follies. Beatrice is trying to rush the boys to Adelaide's and mentions to Greg that he ought to be less decisive like Wirt. Wirt takes offense to this, and at the next stop, a schoolhouse, he decides that, because he's a pushover, he ought to do whatever the teacher says. The teacher, Miss Langtree, sings a lamentful song about her lover, Jimmy Brown, having run off while her father is threatening to shut down the school, and there's a gorilla on the loose. This gorilla chases Greg and some animals into the schoolhouse, where they're corralled into mealtime, and inspired by Beatrice's words from before that he misinterpreted, Greg tries to cheer up the group with a song, only for Mr. Langtree to grow upset with the racket and confiscate all the instruments. But Greg doesn't want the day to end on that negative note, and he sneaks off, coming across the old man as he laments that the school is losing money, and he took the instruments to sell for extra cash to keep it afloat. So Greg organizes a charity concert to raise money for the school. That's a rousing success. The noise attracts the gorilla from earlier, who turns out to be Jimmy Brown in a costume that got stuck, and everyone ends up happily. This episode continues the tradition of establishing tropes only to subvert them near the end. The loose gorilla terrorizing the school town and the lost lover are one and the same, never a force to be feared, even if everyone assumed that that was the case. The curmudgeonly old man trying to shut down the school only put on an act, so the animals learning to read and write wouldn't be demotivated about being a burden. And Greg himself is even able to flip this around on some of the characters they meet. Mr. Langtree assumes that he needs to sell the instruments to keep the school afloat, not realizing the value of keeping them for the school's benefit. And of course, Mrs. Langtree's lamentations were misplaced as well. Also touched upon is Wirt's inability to take decisive action for himself. This is something we saw as early as the first episode, in which Wirt was quick to blame Greg for the things that went wrong, instead of taking responsibility for himself. He has internalized the idea of having no control over things in his life, that when one of his decisions actually does have a consequence, he can't imagine having that sort of power over events, and so he deflects responsibility away. Because to have agency in your own life also means being responsible for what you do wrong. Wirt is a character stuck in indecisiveness, simultaneously wishing for more control, but not being able to overcome the anxiety that that control brings with it. And this is put into contrast with Greg, who is put into contrast with Beatrice. Greg takes control over his actions because he has no anxiety about the consequences. This is often portrayed as a sort of naivety or innocence, but it's never portrayed as an inherently negative thing, because it allows him to progress instead of being afraid of change. Beatrice is the opposite of Greg, to the point that the two struggle to communicate. At the beginning of the episode, she paints a picture of the world as a dark and hopeless place, but instead of the intended demotivating effect she'd hope it would have, it instead makes Greg even more inspired to try to bring some happiness back into the woods. Songs of the Dark Lantern. The trio is thrown off a wagon in their travels and lands near an inn. Beatrice is kicked out as the innkeeper doesn't want a bird inside, so she leaves Wirt and Greg to ask for directions on their own. But while inside, Wirt is introduced to all the patrons there, who exclusively go by their titles, and they sing songs about their professions. When Wirt tries to ask for directions, they demand to know who he is, and when he drops Adelaide's name, they assume that he's in love with her, labeling him as the lover. But his love song is terrible, so they label him the Pilgrim instead, asking for tales of his adventures. These tales result in him revealing what he knows about the beast, and the inn patrons warn him of the beast's MO. He turns lost children into Edelwood trees to keep his lantern burning. They convince him that the woodsman matches this description, and when they hear that Beatrice needs help, Wirt borrows a horse and rushes out to save her. He encounters an injured Beatrice and rushes in to knock over the woodsman and save her, rushing into the night as Wirt reveals that the horse, Fred, can talk, and he knows the way. After they leave, the beast confronts the woodsman, asking if he can hold the lantern as the woodsman is running low on oil, and that his daughter's life force will soon run out. The inn itself seems to aesthetically take inspiration from old Betty Boop cartoons, most notable among them being the Highwayman song reminiscent of Minnie the Moocher. Narratively, there are parallels made to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a series of stories involving a group of characters only given titles rather than names, meeting in a tavern and trading stories of their own professions. These characters only go by what they are instead of who they are, and they demand the same of Wirt. Rather than asking for his story up front, they first need the context of what he's supposed to be before they bother to hear him out, and even then, they project what his tale ought to be instead of listening to reality. The people in the inn are so enthralled by labels and associations that they don't bother to consider the person first, with the label being something applied after the fact. And this application of what instead of who ends with the whole group becoming much quicker to judge others. They know of the beast, and they know a few things about it, so anyone who fits the description that they know must be the beast. The label is applied to the woodsman purely because of his close association. We learn by the end of the episode that this is not the case, and we knew before the episode started that this wasn't true as well. But Wirt is able to be convinced of the falsehood by the inn patrons because he was sweet-talked by them. They sing songs for him and celebrate his travels as the Pilgrim, making Wirt feel as though he belongs. With his ego stroked in this way, he then becomes quick to accept whatever else they might say, purely because he now feels a sense of belonging. He became one of them, and started to think like one of them as well. We've seen in almost every episode so far that whatever expectations the audience, and of course Wirt, start out by making, are always subverted by the end. So to go back on an obvious answer shows a failure by Wirt to pay attention to the pattern, and this is something that he does for the above-listed reasons. Mad Love. The boys and Beatrice are dining with an eccentric entrepreneur named Quincy Endicott, a tea magnate whose mansion is so large he occasionally gets lost inside of it. He fears he's going mad, as he's seen a ghost around, but Greg is excited to see a ghost and urges him and Fred to investigate its whereabouts. Beatrice and Wirt use their absence as an excuse to go searching for money, as Beatrice had the idea to pretend the boys were distant nephews of Endicott's in order to get money out of him to pay for the ferry to Adelaide's. But as they're looking around, they get stuck inside of a cabinet, where the two spend some quality time, Beatrice saying that her family was turned into bluebirds because she threw a rock at one, while Wirt talks about a crush he has back in the real world. They end up finding a secret tunnel into a new mansion, where they come out around the same time that Endicott and Greg stumble upon the beautiful ghost he'd seen. As it turns out, the ghost was actually a rival tea magnate, whose mansion had grown so large that it was entangled with Endicott's, and that they had both been suspecting a ghost. The two fall in love and give 2 cids to the boys as thanks, allowing them to take the ferry. But Fred stays behind to work a legit job for Endicott, and Greg throws the money away to make a pun. There's an implication made throughout the episode that the mansion the boys have wandered into is in fact abandoned. Endicott and Margaret are both deceased, with the sense of irony coming from the fact that while Greg really wanted to see a ghost, he had been traveling with one all along. In a later episode, there's a tombstone with Endicott's name on it, seen in the real world, and the vines covering the plaque with his name indicate that the gardens have been abandoned for a long time. This, combined with the invoked imagery of the 2 coins for the ferry across Styx and Acheron, plus peacocks, which are a symbol of life after death, give this episode a consistent theme of death and rebirth. This is when Beatrice really starts to show hesitation about bringing the boys to Adelaide's house. When she's stuck with Wirt and he suggests that the two get to know each other, she doesn't want to engage in the conversation, as she's afraid of what might happen to her willpower if she starts to grow attached to either of them, whether or not she'll be able to say goodbye when the time comes. We also learn a bit about Wirt. Nothing major, just a childhood crush and his ability to play the bassoon, both of which come back in later episodes, though the third thing about reading poetry to himself has been present since the beginning. This is mirrored in Endicott's hesitations towards seeking out the ghost he believes he's seen. If the ghost is real, then he really did see one, but if he and Greg investigate and find nothing, then he's losing his mind, a fear he expresses having. The ambiguity of the unknown makes him not want to find out the truth, because the truth could potentially be a very negative thing. When you're as lonely and isolated as Endicott is, all you have is your mind, so to lose that means losing everything. In the end, though, this episode continues with the trend we've seen before. The fears that characters have end up being for nothing, as the truth of the situation is that, dead or not, Endicott managed to find some happiness. Lullaby in Frogland. The group is aboard the Frogland ferry, inhabited by humanoid frogs, and they're excited to finally be closer to Adelaide. But Beatrice is hesitant to bring them there, and tries to convince Wirt not to go. Greg realizes that his frog, who he's calling George Washington, has no clothes, and doesn't fit in with any of the other frogs. In addition, the frog police are after the group for sneaking aboard the ferry after Greg threw their money away in the last chapter. They run away from the frogs and pull a trenchcoat ploy to sneak away, but end up getting roped in with the band. As they try to blend in, it turns out that the frog they've been traveling with is a fantastic singer, and he manages to perform for the crowd while Wirt plays the bassoon. Even after the ruse is revealed, the passengers are too enthralled by the performance to be upset, and they successfully arrive at the mud flats, where the frogs start their hibernation, and George is given a record deal. But Beatrice abandons them in the night, with the two boys following after her. When they get to Adelaide's, it's revealed that the reason Beatrice was guiding them there was to trade 2 child servants for a pair of scissors that would turn her and her family human again. After the boys are grabbed, Beatrice opens the window to disintegrate Adelaide with the night air, and they flee into the night, leaving Beatrice behind while George, or Ben, or the frog, reunites with the others. Frog, whatever his name is, sings a song that drops the show's title, Over the Garden Wall. It includes lyrics that refer to future events as well as present people. Wirt is content to be slightly forlorn, an uncomfortable feeling that he still clings on to, as the alternative is learning the truth. We've heard so far that he has a crush on a girl, but during his conversation around the fire with Beatrice, he always finds excuses not to follow up on his feelings. Likewise, he's spent the whole series thus far being indecisive, always willing to let someone else take the lead, such as the goal for the last several episodes of going to Adelaide's house, purely because that's what Beatrice told them to do. By letting others take control, he absolves himself of responsibility. But when Adelaide turns out not to be the kindly old woman he's imagined, but instead tries to capture and own the boys, he finally realizes the error of his ways. It's not only putting himself in danger, but his brother Greg as well, and in the end, not making a decision is, itself, a decision. To absolve yourself of that responsibility doesn't absolve you of everything. As much as he wants to pretend like the things that go wrong are the fault of others, it's still on Wirt that he put everybody in that situation in the first place by allowing others to take advantage of him. The fairy shares a name with the McLuhan brothers, who published several children's books over the decades and served as one of the many inspirations for Over the Garden Wall. This episode also takes plot beats from The Wizard of Oz, another mid-century cultural staple, including a journey to see a promised powerful being who's defeated by something mundane after revealing that she wasn't what she had appeared to be. A plot that isn't only used in this episode, but before and in episodes to come. The Ringing of the Bell. Greg and Wirt are wandering through the woods without Beatrice, despite Greg wanting to go back for her. But he's assured by Wirt that he has a plan, and they go to a cabin in the woods to wait out the rain. There, they meet a young woman named Lorna, who's being compelled to work by Auntie Whispers, a large woman who rings a bell that seems to be controlling Lorna's mind, all while warning of a child-eating demon. Wirt is upset by the way that Lorna is being treated and decides to help her with the housework so she can escape while Auntie Whispers sleeps. But when Greg wakes Auntie Whispers up, she chases them out of the house, yelling about the danger that they're in. As it turns out, Lorna was the demon all along, and she chases them to a river where Greg reveals that the frog ate the bell that controlled her, and Wirt uses it to exorcise the demon. After being saved, Auntie Whispers and Lorna reunite, while Whispers warns the boy about her sister Adelaide, who can't be trusted. While this is all happening, the woodsman is in conversation with the Beast, who reveals that he's very nearly in control of the brothers. Auntie Whispers' appearance and demeanor both give reference to the movie Spirited Away, and the characters of Yubaba and Zinaba. Both of them compel a younger woman into servitude, in this case, Lorna. Despite Greg's anxieties over staying in the seemingly abandoned shack, Wirt insists on going in anyway, then decides to stick around and help Lorna out with the chores in order to free her. It's one of his first decisive actions since abandoning Beatrice in the previous episode, and indicates both his newfound ability to take charge for his own decisions, as well as just how easily tempted by the negativity of the woods he can be. Just as the demon residing inside of Lorna is able to convince Wirt to free it, the Beast is later able to demotivate Wirt into giving up in the next chapter. At the start of this episode, Wirt and Greg encounter the woodsman again, and, still believing him as an enemy, kick at his lantern and run away. Immediately afterwards, they encounter a demon sealed inside of a woman and trust her, all while being afraid of Auntie Whispers, despite her ultimate amicable personality. The thing they fear is something that's merely being manipulated or corrupted by another more sinister force, and it's falling into this sort of trap again that causes Wirt to despair as the two wander into the woods. He finally takes some control over his decisions, only to immediately make the wrong choice and nearly lead the brothers into a worse fate. But it's only through having been manipulated and almost eaten that they're able to exorcise the demon inside of Lorna in the first place, so if he hadn't made that mistake, she would still be suffering. Babes in the Wood. Wirt and Greg are sailing over a river while Wirt finally admits that he doesn't have a plan and doesn't know how to escape the woods, that they'll be lost in there forever. He tells Greg that he no longer wants to be in charge and tries to curl up by a tree to sleep, so Greg covers them in leaves for warmth and tries to come up with a good plan overnight. While he's asleep, he's whisked away by the residents of Cloud City, who sing whimsical songs as they welcome him to their homes. But during the song, Greg accidentally opens the gates to the North Wind, who begins to terrorize Cloud City. All the while in the woods, the boys are freezing in a storm. But Greg is able to overcome the North Wind and is thanked by the Queen of the Clouds, who offers one wish for his deed. Greg wishes for Wirt and himself to be taken home, but the Queen says she cannot do that, as Wirt has already been claimed by the Beast. The vines of the Edelwood tree are already growing around him. So Greg makes a secret wish, and upon waking up, says his goodbyes to Wirt as he walks into the woods alongside the Beast. While searching for his brother, Wirt falls into a frozen lake, only to be saved by Beatrice before passing out. Greg's dream takes inspiration from old Fleischer Brothers cartoons, as well as many mid-20th century works, down to the visual style and use of iris to draw attention to key parts of certain scenes. The children of Cloud City sing multiple songs that reference parts of Greek mythology, the North Wind being a central villain, while the children themselves refer to each other as Onoroi, the personification of dreams, sleep, and death. The ivory gates of the city are coded as false dreams, as referenced in the Odyssey, that the whole incident was an illusion of sorts. So while the imagery is meant to invoke an afterlife, or something like that, as Greg struggles for his life while asleep, the more subtle imagery indicates the beast's influence over Greg, as the end result has him whisking the boy away. And as Greg dreams a parallel to the beast, Wirt's journey into the frozen lake is something referenced in the frog song from Lullaby in Frogland, and that becomes more intentional as the cause of the brothers' journey into the wood is revealed later. We get hints of the cause here. Once again, Wirt blames Greg for goofing around and getting them both lost in there, a regression to an earlier state of mind, as he starts to give up hope and go back to his mentality from the first episode of the series. But at the last moment, once he realizes that he might lose his brother, Wirt finds a second wind to save him, running headlong into the woods and after the beast, despite having spent so long running away from his fears. Into the Unknown. The episode begins in Wirt's bedroom as he tries to assemble a mixtape for his crush, Sarah. When he finally works up the courage to, he attends a football game where she's performing as the mascot, and stares at her from a distance when he's joined by Greg, who just finished some chores for a neighbor. Greg asks to look at the tape and runs off to deliver it, and when Wirt tries to stop him, they're both held up by a group of girls who tease Wirt for his crush. He tries to take back the tape before she finds it, only to learn that Sarah, Jason Funderburger, and some of their friends are going to a graveyard for Halloween. Wirt and Greg follow them there, where Greg finds the frog and introduces Wirt to the group, but they're stopped by some police and they all run away, with Wirt and Greg jumping over the graveyard wall and escaping to some train tracks. He begins to argue with his brother over ruining his dating life when a train arrives and the boys jump off, plunging into the water below. Wirt wakes up surrounded by bluebirds, Beatrice's family, and he sets out in the snow to find his brother. This episode serves as a framing device for practically the whole series thus far. Random details around the neighborhood come back later as part of the unknown, or aspects of what the characters say and do, such as Quincy Endicott's tombstone being present in the graveyard, a background conversation about two old cat, which Greg tries to play with the animals in Schooltown Follies. The boys' outfits are merely Halloween costumes, with Greg attempting an elephant, while Wirt is something. Here, Wirt's anxieties are shown not to be the result of his situation, but something more inherent to him in general. He was worried about being teased for his crush on Sarah, but the girls were really just trying to offer him genuine advice, and even pushed him towards his crush. He feared Sarah's reaction to the tape, but as the next episode reveals, she does not even have a cassette player. Even running from the police, which is how the duo ended up going off the train tracks, is something unnecessary, as the officer was just doing a checkup. He was feeling a sense of dread when he fell into the water, and so that's something that persisted throughout his dive. Greg was trying to think up names for a frog, just as he was at the start of the first chapter. Had he simply waited a while for some elaboration on any of the things he was worried about, Wirt could have avoided a lot of harm. He was afraid of Sarah's reaction and tries to hide from her, but could have waited and heard about the party she went to, a party she was repeatedly asking about his presence in. He was worried about barging in uninvited and only entered when he was worried that Greg was embarrassing him, but it turns out the partygoers were happy to see him. Just as it was in the unknown, most of the anxieties turned out to be false or overblown, and this is something that gets preyed on in the finale. The Unknown. Beatrice sees a glimpse of Greg and the Beast talking but loses them in the snowstorm, flying into Wirt. Greg is receiving a series of impossible challenges from the Beast, meant to tire him out. Meanwhile, the woodsman is running out of fuel for his lantern and tries to head out for another Edelwood tree to keep it lit. He encounters the Beast, who tells him of a new tree growing in the woods. That tree is Greg, and the woodsman refuses to harvest him. Wirt then comes across Greg in the woods and is accosted by the Beast, who offers to place Greg's soul inside of the lantern to grant him longer life force. But Wirt refuses, realizing that he doesn't want to wander the woods forever, and connects the Beast's motivations to the lantern, deducing that it's his life force in there. He threatens to blow it out, but hands it off to the woodsman instead, as it's his burden to bear, and the Beast's life force is snuffed out. Wirt wakes up in a hospital, having rescued his brother from the freezing water, where he sees Greg talking to his friends about their journey. The show then ends with shots of all the citizens of the woods, their problem solved, as they move on with their lives. The use of lighting comes back into play here, with the colors of each act of the episode changing. The first is in stark white, the driving snow being a deadly force in contrast to the light that usually serves as refuge from characters like the Beast. The second act uses darker colors, with most of the screen submerged in blackness save for Greg, Wirt, and their allies. This causes the Beast to stand out even more, as many of the shots of him have nothing illuminated but his eyes and silhouette. But it's ultimately the light that was the Beast's life force, the Edelwood trees all being souls who were lost in the woods he had tricked the woodsman into harvesting for him. He makes the same offer to Wirt in exchange for Greg's life, only to accidentally reveal his hand by revealing his motivation. The final act takes place in the hospital, the color palette no longer defined by black and white, but incorporating blues and greens from the costumes of the well-wishers. The finale then uses a vignette of a keyhole to show how everyone else's story ends, as though we were spectators to their lives instead of living among them. But the boys waking up in the hospital then raises the question of what or where the unknown really is. Much of the imagery invoked is that of life and death, 2 cents for the fairy, or the peacocks, or the dead walking about. But when Greg shakes his frog, Lorna's bell is heard inside of it, which grounds the place in a much more literal plane of existence. Though ultimately discussions on whether it was all a dream don't really matter. Whether or not the events of the show took place entirely inside of Wirt's mind, that doesn't make them any less real. Outro. As Wirt was drowning in the lake, he had a vision of a cartoonish land borrowing from old American cinema from the mid-century, and all the inspirations that have built up to it. And rather than this being something that defines his character of having a love of old movies, it's instead meant as a unifying trait for the audience to relate to the cast. The time period of the scenes in the modern era is left ambiguous, though with enough clues such as the technology available, fact that there was a high school football game, it was Halloween, and the size of the moon, it was likely Friday, October 31st, 1980. As that's the only Halloween Friday with a waning crescent moon between 1970 and 1990. But despite these details being present, it almost feels like a shame to take that level of detail to an analysis. The more solid answers you look for in a show like Over the Garden Wall, the less your interpretation comes from yourself. Trying to find an objective truth will only interrupt your own feelings and initial takeaways from the show. Over the Garden Wall aired in early November 2014, and despite being almost a decade old, is still as discussed now, as though it were brand new. The amount of depth it has makes rewatches just as valuable as the first watch, and almost begs the audience to form a nostalgic bond to it. Just as the imagery of early American black and white cartoons forms an eternal cornerstone of all Western animation. As for the meaning, Wirt is repeatedly afraid of something, or quick to judge only to be proven wrong by what really happens. These two feelings are then conflated. The things we are afraid of are often the things that we judge the fastest. The more you know something, the less terrifying it can be. But in that initial exposure, when you have to confront the fear of the unknown, the one lesson to take away is not to overthink. A nice balance between knowledge and judgment. Many seemingly innocuous things about the unknown turned out to be the real source of horror. The lantern from the start was at first a source of comforting light, then turned out to be the beast's life force. Most of the threat came from imagined versions of events, and from characters who were willing to prey on an overactive imagination. And so being afraid is fine, as long as the thing you're afraid of isn't yourself. Happy Halloween.